Hello and welcome to TK Services. So today I am going to be talking about dividend policy, and this is a topic which comes under the direct ambit of financial management or corporate finance as a subject. Let's try and see the coverage that I am going to keep for this particular online lecture. So I'm going to be discussing the Walters model, the assumptions behind the Walters model, how do you apply the Walters model, and what are the learnings out of the Walters model. Before you get to that, it's very important for you to understand what is the context of this particular topic, and it's, mind you, very important, particularly in terms of its impact on share prices. Now, there are so many investors who have kind of put their stakes or put their bets, placed their bets on the stock market. And as a layman, it's quite difficult for them to comprehend whether the dividend policy can affect the share prices. And to be more specific, whether it's always a good sign to pay dividend, or rather, whether it's always a bad sign for the company not to pay dividend. And if they do pay, or if they do take the right decision, what can be the impact on the share prices? Vis-a-vis, if they take a wrong decision, what can be the impact on the share prices or stock prices of the company under consideration? So let's begin with the Walters model. Now, if you were to understand the Walters model, it starts with this particular formula, which I'm going to show you here. You can see this formula. So here you are saying P is equal to D plus R by KE into E minus D by KE. All right. Where, let me kind of put a nomenclature for you. P is basically the market price of the share or the stock, or let's call this the price because it is more towards intrinsic value. D is the dividend per share, and KE is your cost of equity, or the return that is expected by the shareholders, and R is basically the return which is generated internally. We can take it as return on assets, the return which is generated internally by the organization. So now that you have a nomenclature to each of these terms, and of course E is your EPS, earnings per share. Now that you have understood the terms within this particular formula for share price, let's kind of also spend some time understanding the formula. I always subscribe for students not to memorize the formula, rather to understand them, because if you understand them, it stays in your mind for far longer than if you would just memorize. It's quite a short-term approach. A more deep-rooted approach would be to understand the components of the formula and the logic and the underlying rationale in the formula, which is quite easy for you to then apply whatsoever be the situation. If we were to write the formula here, I have written P is equal to dividend per share plus the return that is generated internally by the organization upon cost of equity multiplied by E minus D, the whole thing divided by the cost of equity. Now, how would you interpret this particular formula? Now, there are two parts to this formula. One is your dividend, and the other is your earnings minus dividend, which is nothing but your retention, which I will denote by B. Now, let's say a company earns a profit of $25,000 and the company has $1,000 share outstanding. So basically then the earnings per share is $25. Now this $25 can be broken up into two parts. Maybe $10 is the dividend that the company has declared, and the remaining $15 is the plowback, which means they do not declare this, rather they plow it back into the organization, so it's their retention. Now the shareholder's perspective, shareholder will earn from both these parts. This is what is called as the immediate return or the recurring return or the realized return, whereas the retention will basically be in the form of capital appreciation for the shareholder. So the shareholder will earn not only by the realized return, which is the immediate return or the dividends, but he will also, the moment the company does not pay dividends or part of the profits is not distributed as dividend, it is plowed back into the company. If it is plowed back, it increases the book value. Consequently, the market capitalization of the company, and therefore the prices of the shares are bound to increase if it's a growing firm, and therefore this will result in long-term capital appreciation of the stock. So that's how the shareholders earn in both these aspects, the immediate benefit as well as the long-term benefit. The immediate one is recurring in nature. The long-term is something which the shareholder will realize only when he sells the stock. Now, what does this R by KE stand? So R by KE basically means compared to the return that the shareholders expect, what is the return that is generated by the company? As long as the return that is generated internally is higher than the expected return, it's better for the company not to distribute any dividend because it's a growing firm. And therefore, the shareholders will also be happy to earn a much higher return if the company does not pay dividend and put it back into the organization because it grow at a higher rate compared to when the company does declare dividends and they invest outside to achieve their minimum return of cost of equity. This is a far better option. Whereas if the R is less than the KE, in that case, what will happen? So let's say in this particular case, the R is less than the KE. We are talking about the internal return. If it is less than the cost of equity, it's always better for the organization to pay the dividends. Now let's try and understand this topic in a little more detail. Now, if you look at a product life cycle or a business cycle is something like this. The business starts growing, and then after it reaches a certain level of growth, it kind of stagnates, and then there is a decline period. Now this period here that you see, this is the growth period of the firm or the product. This period here with the horizontal stripes is the stable period for the firm, and this period here is the decline period for the product or the business. Now in this period, mind you, the organizations typically tend to give higher returns, and therefore returns may not be in the form of recurring dividends, it could be in the form of capital appreciation. Therefore in this period it's always better, and you will typically see that the return that is generated internally will tend to be higher than the cost of equity, and therefore it's always better for the company not to pay dividend, rather to plow this money back in terms of profits inside the organization, so that the return in terms of capital appreciation outperforms or beats the return that they would have otherwise received as dividend. Somewhere in this period, in the decline period, typically there will become a stage where the R will fall below the cost of equity or the expected return from the shareholders, and this is the period when it's always better for the company to declare the dividends. Okay, now that you have got some context, let's put some numbers behind this theory so that you understand this theory a lot better. It's so much easier to understand when you kind of apply this in terms of a numerical example, because then it tells you the logic as well is very clear to you in terms of what this model is trying to achieve. So I have a small example for you in terms of application. So let's look at a forecast that the company has compiled for the next year. So you have your P&L in front of you. It's the sales of 2,500 crores, 1,500 crores of variable costs and direct costs, giving you a gross profit of 1,000 crores, 200 crores of OPEX, giving an EBITDA of 800 crores, 300 crores of depreciation, giving an operating income of 500 crores, 100 crores of interest, giving a profit before tax of 400 crores, assuming a tax rate of 40%. Your tax liability provided in the books is 160 crores, giving a PAT of 240 crores. Now assume that there are 12 crores shares outstanding for this particular organization. Therefore, the earnings per share which you will get after you divide the profit after tax by the number of shares, the earnings per share is 20 rupees per share. Now assume that the company is declaring 15% of its profits as earnings, therefore the dividend per share comes to 3 rupees. And the forecasted market price, or let's say the current market price of the firm, so I'll put this in a different color because this reflects the current scenario, whereas all the others are basically forecasts. Now this is a forecasted EPS, this is a forecasted dividend per share, this is a current market price. Let's assume that the assets today are 2,880 crores. So the return on assets and obviously will therefore be, it's nothing but your PAT. So if you divide your PAT, this is the profit which is available to shareholders divided by the asset base of the organization, and you take it in percentage terms, it comes to 8.33%. So this is your anticipated or forecasted return on your assets. Let's assume that there is a growth in dividends which is estimated at 6%. And how do you get the cost of equity? Now you are aware of the formula for, let's quickly do that for you also so that there's no confusion. So let me derive this formula. You are aware of wherever there is a constant growth in the share prices and dividends, you can use this formula, which is the Gordon's constant growth formula, which tells you that P0 is D1 divided by KE, cost of equity, minus the growth rate. If you solve for KE, you will get KE minus G is equal to D1 by P0. Or you should therefore get, it translates to cost of equity is D1 by P0 plus G. So if you note this formula carefully, the forecasted dividend divided by the current market price plus the estimated growth rate in the dividend. So if you apply this here in this particular Excel sheet, so your forecasted dividend is 3 divided by the current market price 75 plus the growth rate expected, it should give you a 10%, which is what I have taken in this particular cell. By way of formula, this is what is derived. Now you have got all the possible values that you need to put this into a formula. Now let's quickly also try and align to what we just learned. Now, is this particular policy that you are seeing now, is this an appropriate policy or is it not an appropriate policy? Now, if you look here, the return on the assets generated by the firm is 8.33%, whereas the returns expected by the shareholders is 10%. Therefore, the company is generating lesser returns internally compared to what the shareholders expect. Therefore, in this particular case, it's always better for the company to distribute higher dividends because they have anyways reached a stable phase. So they are not, I mean, they do have growth, but their growth is not incrementally or disproportionately high. And it is not in increasing proportions. It's more of a stable growth, or rather I would say they are in a stable phase. They've kind of stagnated, and therefore it's always better for the company to distribute the dividends because they will not be able to match up to the shareholder expectations otherwise, which is higher than the return than the shareholders will generate. To put it in simple terms, if they plow back this money into, let's say the total profits is X, if they plow this back into the company, that money will fetch 8.33% for the shareholders. Whereas the shareholders expect 10%. That means if you distribute it as dividend, they can reinvest it outside at an alternative investment plan and they can fetch 10% for themselves. So it's better for the company, therefore, to pay higher dividends. Whereas if you see in this particular example, out of the 20 rupees that the company has earned per share, or the shareholders have earned 20 rupees per share, they are getting only 3 rupees, which is 15%. So the dividend payout ratio is only 15%. And therefore, this is not an appropriate policy. How do you justify that in terms of the formula and application of Walter's model? Now, if you look here, what have I done? I have tried to find out the current market price. If you let's quickly find that out for you. How do I get this 172? Now, if you look at the formula here, it's your current dividend plus return on assets divided by cost of equity multiplied by earnings minus dividend. So this I am going to put in the bracket. The whole thing is going to be divided by the cost of equity, which is 10%. So if you look here, I get 172 rupees as the current forecasted price with the Walters model. Now, is this the maximum price that the shareholder can achieve, or the maximum price that the company can achieve? The answer is no, because they are not following the right or the appropriate dividend policy. As I told you, since the return on the assets is less than the cost of equity, it's better for the company to distribute the dividends so that The shareholders can reinvest these profits outside and earn their expected return of 10%. That means share price should ideally be maximized when the entire amount of earning is distributed as EPS, which means your dividend per share should be actually 20, and the other component E minus D will become 0 because the E will be equal to D. So I will just divide 20 by the cost of equity of 10%. So the maximum share price is 200 is what I have denoted here. And the price will be minimized when the company completely follows a wrong policy or an inappropriate dividend policy, which means it does not declare any dividend at all. That means the dividend per share will be 0 and the entire amount of earnings, which will be like this: return divided by cost of equity into 20, because that's your earning, divided by the cost of equity here. So that should be your minimum share price, which is 167, which is what I have denoted here. So this is how I have got the three prices. So the forecasted price is 172, which is when the company follows the current dividend policy. Mind you, this is still not an appropriate dividend policy. So when the company follows a completely appropriate dividend policy, there are chances of the share prices reaching its maximum value of 200 rupees. Whereas if the company does not follow, it completely follows an inappropriate dividend policy and does not declare anything as dividend, the share price will reach its minimum of 167. So the range that you see here, if you look at the graph, I have put out this on a graph. The company at its current level is at this range. Forecasted dividend is, forecasted price based on the current dividend policy is rupees 172. If the company switches to a most appropriate dividend policy, that is, it distributes the entire amount as dividend because the return generated by the firm is less than the cost of equity, in such case the share price can be maximized and can reach 200 rupees level. Whereas if it does not declare any dividend, which is a completely inappropriate policy, your share price will reach to its minimum point, which is 167. Okay. Now, if you note the current price, it is closer to the minimum and farther away from the maximum. Now, why is that? Because the company is distributing only 15% of the profits. If you look here, the company is just distributing 15% of the earnings. So the 20 out of 20 rupees, only 3, which is 15% is being distributed. Okay, whereas in this case 100% should have been distributed. So the company is closer to an inappropriate dividend policy and farther away from an appropriate dividend policy, and therefore the forecasted price is closer to the minimum price as compared to the maximum price. Let's change the scenario a little. Let's say the company pays 15 rupees as dividend, or forecast to pay 15 rupees as dividend out of the 20 of EPS. Now if you look here, there will obviously be change in the cost of equity, which will rise because of the higher dividend that is being paid, and therefore the prices will move, it will move downwards because the company is paying higher dividends. Higher dividends always have the tendency to hit the stock price, and the stock price moves downwards because there is a capital erosion in terms of the dividend that is being paid back to the shareholders. So the forecasted price is 64, whereas now the range widens. The minimum price is 25 and the maximum price is 77, applying the same formula as per the Walters model. Now if you note here, this 64 will be closer to the 77 compared to the 25, which means the forecasted price will be closer to the maximum price compared to the minimum price. Now why is that? Because now the company is towards following a better policy or a more appropriate dividend policy, which you can see here. The return is only 8.33%, whereas the cost of equity is 26%. So it's always better to for the company to distribute more and more dividends. And here the company is distributing 75%. 75% of 20 is 15. So the company is forecasting to distribute 75% of its profits, and therefore the share price forecasted is moving towards maximum share price and farther away from minimum share price. So if you look at the graph here, which changes automatically. If the company follows an appropriate dividend policy, the forecasted share price will move closer to the maximum and farther away from the minimum. So this, my dear friends, was the Walters model, and also the application of the Walters model and the learnings out of the Walters model. So if I were to ask you a question, or if you are asked this question in your placement interviews, does dividend, I have seen this question being asked, does dividend policy impact share price? Now you should have absolutely no confusion in answering. The answer is yes. How does dividend policy affect share price? You should say that the appropriate dividend policy will lead the market prices towards its maximum, whereas inappropriate dividend policies will pull these prices down towards the minimum, and that's how the share prices will always fluctuate between a maximum and minimum range, and the appropriate dividend policy will therefore clearly have a visible impact on the share price. Now the last part which remains is the assumptions behind the Walters model. Note that Walters model also has certain assumptions. What are those assumptions? The assumptions typically are that the company is basically plowing back the profits at the same rate of return. The cost of equity is constant, and the return on assets generated is also assumed to be constant. These particular assumptions are a little theoretical in nature, and these are also the infirmities or shortcomings in the model, the assumptions which can get a little difficult to comprehend and digest in a real life dynamic situation. So these are the assumptions behind the model, but the model still goes a long way in definitely telling you that appropriate dividend policy is so crucial in terms of the company being able to achieve its current share price and hence current market capitalization. So this, my dear friends, was a small synopsis on the Walters model. I hope you enjoyed it. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel Concept Canvas. Stay tuned for more engaging videos. Thank you very much.